So far as the history of English literature is concerned, the 19th century, that is 1800 AD to 1899 AD, can be divided into two distinct literary periods, the Romantic period and the Victorian period. The major Romantic novelists are Jane Austen, 1711 to 1817, and Sir Walter Scott, 1771 to 1832. And the major Victorian novelists are Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870, William Makepeace Thackeray, 1811 to 1863, the Bronte Sisters, George Eliot, 1819 to 1880, Thomas Hardy, 1840 to 1928. The immense richness of the genre of the English novel came from the variety of treatment of this genre for different purposes down the ages. While entertainment through storytelling has been the primary reason, novel has always played an immensely important role in exploring different contemporary issues. In the late 18th century, fiction was the most popular medium to promulgate new social theories. This gave rise to the novel of doctrine. The novel of doctrine gradually evolved into novel of manners. And perhaps the greatest of all novelists of manner is Jane Austen. Austen's fictional world portrayed a very limited world which she knew, but the picture she presents in her novels was grounded upon a comprehensive knowledge of human nature. She mainly explored the personal relationships of men and women, examining these relations with the shrewdness and acumen of the satirist. These men and women are mostly middle class and provincial, their biggest ambition being successful marriage. But Austen presents and places them in brilliantly integrated plots so as to look at them from 1,000 facets, and most of them therefore ultimately evolve as round characters. Austen's style reminds us of Congreve's comedies in their fine mixture of ironic wit, delicate precision, seeming simplicity which masks subtlety, and all these Austen uses to explore the worth of human emotions against the socio-economic framework which defines human lives. The next important figure in the Romantic period, so far as English novel is concerned, is Sir Walter Scott. Scott's Waverley novels are some of the best examples of the historical novel, a genre which became immensely popular in the 19th century. Historical novel, as J.A. Carden defines it in the Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory, is a form of fictional narrative which reconstructs history and recreates it imaginatively. In fact, it is not a narration of historical events per se, but it is an attempt to situate the characters in a given time span of history, which would help the author to explore history and bring out the whole truth of the times. The Waverley novels are brilliant attempts in that way to explore medieval England, France, and Germany and portray the life and manners of the bygone days. Scott was at his best when he dealt with Scottish history. These novels are marked by Scott's nostalgia for the old independent Scotland. Underlying these novels, as David Deutsch puts it succinctly, a tragic sense of the inevitability of a drab but necessary progress, a sense of the importance of the traditional kind of heroism, a passionately regretful awareness of the fact that the good old cause was lost forever. All of Scott's novels are marked by this kind of nostalgia. We shall now turn over to the Victorian novel. The Victorian age perhaps is the most important age so far as the production of novel in English is concerned. The Victorian age was primarily an age of the novel because of the incredible variety and quantity the genre displayed during the period. There are some tangible reasons behind the growth of this genre, behind this prolific production of novel, the most important of which is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution and the consequent rise of the middle class is actually responsible for this prolific rise of the novel, because the middle class provided both the subject and the readership to the genre. The next cause is, of course, advancement of science and crisis of faith. There is another important cause: printing became less costly. In fact, the middle class of this period, they considered themselves to be a part of the parvenu civilization. They considered themselves to be quite modern, and that is why advent of science with the spread of education, they thought it worthwhile to keep themselves abreast of all that is happening all around. That is why they started reading everything that came to them. But as you realize, it was not possible for them to delve deep into the poetry, which needed a lot of intellectual ability. Novel, especially because of its storytelling element, was immensely popular, and the middle class instantly grabbed every novel that came to their hand. The person best suited to cater to the taste and expectations of this Victorian middle class readers was a man no other than Charles Dickens, primarily because he was richly endowed with creative energy and showmanship, by virtue of which he could create a superb range of characters. If you read Dickens's novels, you will instantly realize that Dickens was not a master creator of plots. He could not delve deep into the intricate plot construction, but what he excelled in was the creation of some unforgettable characters, through the exploration of which he could help contemporary readership empathetic imagination for fellow citizens. In an age threatened by selfish materialism, Dickens foregrounded in his novels the importance of warm human bonding and how this, and not any organization or system, can create a better society. Three elements in Dickens's experience must be considered as the determining influences on his work. The first was the hardship of his early life. The episodes and characters of this time made an ineffaceable impression on his memory. The description in his autobiography of a scene in the Marseillais prison or of the rat-infested warehouse actually reads like a passage out of Oliver Twist or David Copperfield. The remembrance of his childhood aroused in Dickens his keen sympathy with suffering children everywhere. The humiliations which he suffered as he sought to rise in the world, including those terrible days when he had to work as a laborer in the workhouse, in the blackening factory, gave him that animus against the prosperous middle class, which appears so often in his novels. All along his life, Dickens nourished a romantic notion that honesty, kindness, and true worth of character were to be chiefly were to be found chiefly among the poor. Dickens's sentimental feeling for the unfortunate came to reinforce the humanitarians who in the middle of the century were becoming acutely conscious of the exploitation of the working class under the industrial system. In fact, it is this feeling for the poor that brought him very close to Thomas Carlyle, who himself carried over an ingrained sympathy with the poor from his own poverty-stricken youth. It is from Carlyle that Dickens gained his indignation at the failure of the government to deal with social conditions and his scorn of government machinery and institutions, particularly the administration of the Poor Law of 1834, which established the workhouses. His most serious novel, Hard Times, which is an indictment of the political economy of the Manchester School and the scientific scheme of life propounded by the utilitarians, were dedicated to Carlyle quite justifiably. A second element of Dickens's experience that contributed to his training as a novelist was journalism. As a reporter, he learned to know London and its teeming life, from the blackened and broken buildings along the Thames, which housed poverty and crime, to the cheerful collages of the suburbs. In fact, we must remember that with the rise of the middle class, the novelists had to satisfy two needs. On the first hand, they had to primarily entertain readership, and this was particularly important in the absence of any other forms of entertainment like the television or the internet. And secondly, it was also necessary to use this popular genre to explore some problems which concerned the middle class. There might be very basic problems like the problem of sanitation in the very shabby living conditions of the middle class laborers, factory workers. It might be the issue of like pollution in the Thames, but at the same time, the challenge was to entertain this readership and making them realize, feel for their fellow citizens. But as I told you that in the Victorian period, there was an immense variety, and the major novelists are interesting because each one of them contributed to the world of the English novel in his own way. The next character that we should consider is William Makepeace Thackeray. And in many ways, Thackeray was a sharp contrast to Dickens. Thackeray's experience, upon which he based his novels, was exclusively of the upper middle class of the society. The most important novel that made Thackeray famous was Vanity Fair. His masterpiece Vanity Fair is an authentic picture of the contemporary nouveau riche, presented with clear-sighted realism and sparkling irony. The Industrial Revolution was an opportunity to this nouveau riche to instantly amass a lot of wealth because of the flow of raw materials from the colonies, and the government insisted that if these people could invest capital, the government would not intervene in their way of setting up new industries. As a result of which, they developed a new class, the nouveau riche, who became rich overnight. And these riches, this instant riches that they accumulated, started defining a new kind of value system against which Thackeray targeted his shaft. In Thackeray's novels, one would hardly find overdramatic climaxes. Rather, he observes that life has a fondness for understatement and undertones. Herein lies the difference between his style and that of Dickens. Dickens would always love to take his characters to breathtaking and often melodramatic climaxes, but Thackeray would always focus on the understatements of life. But there is one major shortcoming in Thackeray. Thackeray allows little room for self-analysis in his characters. The next major contribution to the world of Victorian novel came from the Bronte sisters. The unique contribution of the Bronte sisters to the domain of English literature was a strange mingling of wild romance and domestic realism, cosmic poetry and local detail. The Bronte sisters, there were three sisters, Charlotte Bronte, Anne Bronte and Emily Bronte. Of these three sisters, we have remembered Emily Bronte mainly because of her most famous novel, Wuthering Heights. The Bronte sisters' novels were a clear departure from the social concerns, but were endeavors to express private passions. The critics often comment that the romantic elements did not die with the Romantic period, but they continued in the Victorian period as well. In the world of novel, this can be best exemplified by novels like Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is unique because it is defined by a strong power of imagination, a kind of imagination which baffles critics even today. Wuthering Heights is a story which takes a departure from the common social concerns and enters the world of Gothic. It presents two binary worlds of passion and reason, of discord and harmony in conflict. Wuthering Heights actually is the dark, storm-tossed center of violent passions where elemental forces hold complete sway. Wuthering Heights was something completely new in the world of English novel. But then we shall have to consider another very important novelist who is George Eliot. George Eliot was her pen name. This was a pseudonym. Her actual name was Mary Ann Evans. George Eliot was the first English novelist to combine high moral seriousness and intellectual issues with the purpose to entertain. As a result, it was she who made the novel intellectually respectable without losing anything of its qualities of liveliness or entertainment. In fact, from Bronte Sisters to George Eliot is like a journey that you would take from a storm-tossed evening outside along the moors to the cozy drawing room where the fireplace is lit with fire and the room is warm and comfortable. George Eliot's novels are serious enterprises in the sense that she examines characters in relation to an ideal based on certain moral principles of truth and goodness. Such moral principles gave to her novels rigidity, but also power and strength. Our deeds determine us as much as we determine our deeds is an assertion which she justifies through her novels. She is an austere rationalist and she is interested in human motives. In fact, what George Eliot does in her novels is to place each and every character in certain situations. And make them react and respond to those situations according to their mental and moral makeup. If they fail to keep up to certain moral standards, then suffering is the only thing that is left for these characters. But nevertheless, suffering is something very important in George Eliot, because she thinks suffering alone can lead to the knowledge of self. The insistence on the moral structure was also responsible for the decline in her popularity later on. But George Eliot was so intent on driving her moral lessons home that she would intersperse the novel with innumerable philosophic remarks, often to the point of becoming a little didactic. But unlike the typical instinctive Victorian novelist, George Eliot was out and out an intellectual writer. She supplies much that was lacking in Dickens and Thackeray. She would like to engage in intellectual discussion concerned with serious problems, politics and philosophy. If you take a look at the chief characters, you will find them consisting of scholars, politicians, artists, musicians, men of science. Her mind was always active, analyzing and generalizing on the basis of worldly experience. For this reason, her books are invariably constructed around a central idea which determines their form. Secondly, George Eliot uses a convincing dynamic psychology in presenting her characters. She was perhaps the first Victorian novelist to depict a character from the inside and to portray realistically the spectacle of determination in people who are not intrinsically evil. Her most complex characters ring true because the changes and apparent contradictions in them are always firmly related, as they are in life, to some certain central principles. She knows very well why ambitions are frustrated, why idealists desert their ideals, why the bright promise of youth so often fades into insignificance. Thackeray had perceived this too, but Thackeray lacked George Eliot's burning moral passion and remained content to record satirically what he had seen of the pathetic weaknesses of the flesh. George Eliot, on the other hand, recreates the West and brings out the tragic implications of the betrayal. George Eliot's sense of tragedy in life is Aristotelian. Some hidden flaw, some weaknesses unseen by the outer world, unsuspected even by the possessor perhaps, undermine what is otherwise a good and perhaps potentially noble character. What seems a hostile destiny is in reality, for George Eliot, the failure of the individual to be true to the best that is within him. His surrender to the inherent weaknesses. Recognizing this truth, George Eliot shows her skill in contriving situations that test her character. Once the basic flaw and its probable effect on the destiny is discovered, no melodrama, no psychological miracle, but a lifelike development of characters is what we find in George Eliot. Once the basic flaw and its probable effect on the destiny is discovered, the rest of the novel is actually an illustration of how that flaw and the character's response to that particular flaw determines his life throughout the novel. There is otherwise no melodrama, no psychological miracle, but a lifelike development of the characters. So George Eliot's supreme quality as a novelist is high seriousness. She has a lofty conception of life, a belief that there is something in human beings that makes for righteousness, and that tragedy lies in the constant betrayal of man by himself. Like Browning, George Eliot is a moral optimist. Optimism springs from a conviction based on fundamental respect for what is best within, and the certainty that the purpose of life is to secure the ultimate triumph of good. The last major novelist that we should consider in this lecture is Thomas Hardy. Hardy too, like some of his senior contemporaries, examine human characters with irony. But his irony is directed at the very conditions of human existence. He would not direct his irony at any human character in particular, but would like to see these human characters as puny little human beings placed, engaged in a lopsided battle with a huge force called immanent will, over which they have no control whatsoever. For this purpose, he sets his characters in Wessex, a fictional name that he gives to the southern agricultural corner of England. And against this bleak backdrop, Hardy goes on narrating tales of simple love and passion, honest labor, and harmless ambitions of common human beings, and the resulting frustration. In fact, Hardy saw the universe as a vast machine which is soulless and indifferent to humanity. And therefore, all his novels mourn the tragic suffering of innocent human lives, and an inescapable feeling of bitterness permeates his novels. In the last two novels, however, this bitterness is mixed with genuine anger, with the hypocrisy of certain contemporary social institutions like marriage and religion, which he complains join hands with immanent will to crush human lives. In fact, Tales of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure are two of the best accomplished novels by Hardy, but many critics find the atmosphere in these novels so nauseating that it pervades the entire mind of the reader with a sense of depression and takes them to a dystopic world. In fact, Hardy was very much concerned with the hypocrisy of the social institutions, and it is because of the unholy collusion of these social institutions with that huge force which actually caused a terrible anguish in the mind of Hardy, and for which he thinks life becomes impossible on earth. It is precisely at this point that Hardy even went to the point of thinking that not to be born is perhaps the best thing that could have happened to human beings. We must also utter the name of at least three minor novelists in the same breath. First of them is Elizabeth Gaskell, whose name has been associated with condition of England novels. In fact, though all Victorian novels, and for that matter all novels, deal with contemporary social condition, but Elizabeth Gaskell's novels had done that with such authenticity because of her first-hand knowledge about the industrial England of Manchester, that a novel like North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell gives us some of the most important information and give us a feeling about the pain and frustration of the laborers in this industrial England. That is why her novels have been associated with, has been described by this tag, condition of England novels. The other name is Wilkie Collins, who was perhaps the first English novelist to deal with detection of crime in novel. And finally, Anthony Trollope, who portrayed faithfully the tranquil Victorian England of which he was a member.